Oh, good evening. If I were to hazard a guess about how many people in this room have ever attended a solo piano recital, I will be reasonably confident in saying no less than 75%. If I was to make a similar guess about how many of us here tonight have ever attended a solo violin recital, and by this I mean a complete recital of unaccompanied violin, without piano, I would say no more than 10%. So why is the solo violin recital today so much more the exception than the rule? The cornerstone of the solo violin repertory are the 6 solo violin sonatas and partitas that Bach wrote in 1720 when he was in Curtin. During this time, Bach was director of music to Leopold, Prince of Anhalt-Gotha. In this period, that begins in 1717 and ends in 1723, he concentrated primarily on chamber music. The wonderful Brandenburg concertos date from this time. The 6 pieces for solo violin represent one of the most sublime levels of musical thought in the entire Western canon. When a violinist makes a recording of these works, it is an ordeal by fire, because he or she knows that they will be recorded to the greatest violinists in the history of recorded sound. It's telling that the 3 premier violinists of the last century, Heifetz, Arthur Grumio, and Nathan Milstein, all recorded these pieces. The crucial point is that after the time of Bach, the solo violin genre went out of fashion. So this continues to be a source of major regret among violinists. Imagine how much richer the world would be if there were an entire cycle of solo violin pieces, courtesy of Mozart. So when we come to the classical era, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms all wrote for the violin, but only with accompaniment, either keyboard in the case of sonatas or orchestra in the context of concertos. It's not until the Romantic era that unaccompanied violin genre comes back. So the major figure from this period is Paganini. The solo violin caprices of Paganini, in many ways, constitute the composer-violinist's answer to the transcendental etudes of Franz Liszt. Both collections of pieces were written by composers who were very active as virtuosos in their day, and both collections are designed to show off the technical prowess of their respective instruments. In the 20th century, we see composers of major stature writing for unaccompanied violin. Ysaÿe, Bartók, and Hindemith are cases in point. So I'm pleased to report that as I speak, the solo violin genre is alive and well. Composers all over the globe are writing for it. While the number of solo violin pieces will always be eclipsed by the range of pieces written for the piano, it is heartening to observe that many composers are writing for this idiom and are showing no signs of slowing down. It's somewhat misleading to speak of Bach's 6 works for solo violin as a single collection, for in reality they comprise 2 cycles, namely 3 sonatas and 3 partitas. The 3 sonatas all adhere to the same formal design. In the first movement, while the music is strictly notated, it has the aura of an improvisation. The second movement always consists of a fugue. The third movement is slow and more relaxed than the formidable fugue that preceded it. The final movement always consists of a rapid movement, the fast tempo. So while the 3 sonatas all adhere to the same formal design, I do not for a minute wish to suggest they sound alike. On the contrary, it is a testament to Bach's supreme genius that he was able to produce such profoundly different works whose fundamental formal design just happens to be the same. The 3 solo violin partitas consist of a succession of dance movements. The dances on which the partitas are based come from all over Europe. So, for example, while the saraband hails from Spain, the gigue is of Irish origin. No 2 partitas offer exactly the same succession of movement types. While the solo violin partitas are profoundly different from the sonatas, one vital trait shared by all 6 pieces is the technique of implied harmony. Regardless of whether Bach asks the violinist to play a 4-note chord or a single melody, he is always using the violin to project a multi-voiced texture. It is telling that on the cover page of Bach's original manuscript, he appended the words senza basso accompagnato, the title. This is Italian for without bass accompaniment. In Bach's day, there was a time-honored tradition of compositions for a single melodic line and bass or basso continuo. The harpsichordist would play the notated bass part with his left hand, complemented by chords in the right hand. The figured bass would indicate how the chords in the right hand are to be voiced. Case in point is Bach's Sonata for Flute and Continuo in E minor. But with the solo violin works, Bach went out of his way to emphasize a point that was far from merely rhetorical, namely that his compositions for unaccompanied violin were fully fledged pieces in their own right, requiring no elaboration of the harmony on a keyboard. So in short, his solo violin works are a veritable law unto themselves. They're self-sufficient. While the Viennese music theorist Heinrich Schenker has offered valuable insights in Bach's writing for solo violin, it was not until 1999 that the first book on the subject appeared. The title is Bach's Works for Solo Violin, Style, Structure, Performance. And the author is Joel Lester. As a respected theorist and accomplished violinist, Lester was ideally placed to write this book. It offers a goldmine of information about Bach's technique of implied harmony. One thing is definite in applying this technique. Bach drew upon the solo violin compositions of his predecessors. In short, he did not invent the technique. Rather, he absorbed it and applied it with very impressive results. In a similar way, he absorbed the basic principles underlying the instrumental concertos of the Italian school, epitomized by Vivaldi, and drew on these principles with amazing results. Johann Paul von Westhoff was a violinist and composer born in Dresden in 1656. He wrote 6 partitas for solo violin, published in 1696. It is possible that von Westhoff met Bach in Weimar in 1703. Without a doubt, there is a discernible connection between von Westhoff's writing for solo violin and Bach's. The second movement of von Westhoff's first partita in A minor almost certainly influenced Bach in writing the first movement of his second partita. The Austrian violinist and composer Johann Joseph Welsmeyer was born in 1663. He wrote 6 partitas for solo violin, published in 1715. The prelude of his 5th partita in G minor may well have influenced Bach in writing the chaconne of his second partita. There is an important distinction between the solo violin works of Bach's predecessors and contemporaries on the one hand, and those written by Bach himself on the other. The works of Bach's predecessors and contemporaries are generally played today only by Baroque experts on historical instruments, whereas the solo works of Bach have been championed by the greatest violinists of the 20th century, continuing well into this century on modern instruments, in addition to Baroque experts. Sometimes Bach may use register to distinguish different voices. For example, a melody in the upper register is answered by a tune in the lower register, thus setting in motion a dialogue of voices. We'll hear an example of this tonight in the third movement of Bach's first sonata. Music from Bach's era is renowned for the use of melodic sequences. Just to give a simple example, a violinist will play a motive, would then hear the same motive repeated at a higher pitch level, and after that the motive may be repeated a second time at a higher pitch level. The final result is the same motive moving up by a step. This is known as an ascending sequence. In Bach's solo violin works, the composer projects implied harmony by writing a single line using a sequence of ascending or descending motives. We will hear a highly developed example tonight in the final movement of the Bach composition. In that movement, we shall also hear sequences of arpeggios, a highly effective way of implying more than one voice. There is no doubt that the use of chords contributes significantly to implied harmony. While the violin can produce chords of up to 4 notes, it is not possible to attack the notes in the chord at the same time unless it's a 2-note chord comprising notes on adjacent strings. The larger chords can be executed only by moving the bow across the strings. I have already mentioned that the second movement of each of Bach's solo sonatas consists of a fugue. How is it remotely possible to write a fugue for a single stringed instrument? Many of us have heard choral fugues written by Bach comprising free-flowing polyphony at a rapid tempo. A wonderful example from the Mass in B minor is the last chorus of the Gloria, titled Cum Sancto Spiritu in Gloria Dei Patris, with the Holy Ghost in the glory of God the Father. Great genius though he was, Bach knew that he could never write for a single violin like this. To begin with, the fugues of these solo violin sonatas each suggest a medium or medium-fast tempo, but never a very rapid one. Bach uses chords to punctuate or sound against a single melodic line. This technique sounds simple. Each specific application requires a first-rate musical mind to bring it off. Bach's fugues for solo violin are remarkable feats of technique in their own right. They are so startling as to require many hearings in order to absorb the magnitude of his accomplishment. The word startling is apposite, since it reflects perhaps the most admirable trait of his solo violin works, namely that despite being precisely 300 years old, they have aged not one iota. On the contrary, in the hands of a skilled player, they sound as if they could have been written only yesterday. So we will now hear Anna play Bach's Solo Violin Sonata number 1 in G minor. Before Anna begins, could I ask you to switch off your phones and mobile devices? In 1782. He was a very gifted violinist, great renown. His 24 caprices for solo violin were written between 1802 and 1817. They take the form of etudes, with each individual piece calling for a specific skill. Without a doubt, a formidable technique is required to play these pieces convincingly. The general consensus among musicians is that Paganini did not absorb the lesson of implied harmony from the solo violin works of Bach. Earlier on, I drew a comparison between Paganini and Liszt. As it happened, Liszt made arrangements of no less than 5 of Paganini's caprices for the piano. Henryk Wieniawski was born in Lublin in 1835 and died in 1880. Since Wieniawski was born 5 years before Paganini died, the two composers cannot be said to belong to the same generation. However, there is no doubt that the younger composer followed in Paganini's wake. His principal contribution to the realm of solo violin writing is a work called The Modern School, 10 Etudes Caprices. As is the case with Paganini's caprices, each individual piece poses a formidable challenge to the violinist's skill. On listening to the whole collection, I do not have a sense of a profound use of implied harmony. The main exception appears to be the 6th caprice, titled Prelude. Here, one has a definite sense of polyphony in the first section, along with the written-out reprise of that section. Henri Vieuxtemps was born in Belgium 1820, and being only 15 years older than Wieniawski, he belonged pretty much to the same generation. An early work, 6 concert etudes, opus 16, written when the composer was 25, follows in the romantic wake of Paganini. A much later work, 6 Morceaux or 6 pieces, opus 55, was published posthumously. These very special pieces are much closer to the Bach tradition than to the romantic generation to which Vieuxtemps belonged. The final piece is called Introduction and Fugue and is arguably the most transparently Bach-like, as the title may suggest. The Belgian violinist and composer Ysaye, spelled Y-S-A-Y-E, was born in Liège in 1858. His principal creative legacy is a set of 6 wonderful sonatas for solo violin, written in 1923. Each sonata is dedicated to a different violinist whom the composer knew personally. The solo sonatas of Ysaye are redolent of the Bach tradition from beginning to end. As surely as the solo pieces of Paganini are primarily monophonic, the sonatas by Ysaye are intrinsically polyphonic. His second sonata even goes so far as to open with a direct quotation from the prelude of Bach's third partita in E major. However, it should be stressed that in Ysaye's solo works, direct quotations are the exception rather than the rule. So if we were to sum up Ysaye's life achievement in just a few words, it might be that he succeeded in absorbing Bach into a more modern-sounding harmonic idiom. On the one hand, his sonatas are traditionally tonal since they are written in a specific key. On the other hand, in certain places, they reflect the influence of Debussy and the French school. For example, the third movement of Sonata Number 1 features perfect fourths alternating with perfect fifths. This would have been strictly forbidden by Bach. So when we come to the solo violin pieces of Bartók and Hindemith, it is not surprising that their sound is even more modern. While both composers are tonal insofar as they employ harmonic centers, there is a tendency to access more notes of the chromatic scale. While Hindemith was younger than Bartók, his works for solo violin precede Bartók's own sonata. Paul Hindemith was born in 1895 in Hanau, a small town in Germany. He died in 1963. Hindemith wrote 3 sonatas for solo violin. His first sonata is in G minor and was completed in 1918. 6 years later, in 1924, he wrote 2 sonatas that comprise his Opus 31. A mere glance at the score of his second sonata tells us that Hindemith had undergone a big change. To begin with, there is an absence of a key signature in each of the 5 movements. Moreover, while the first movement starts on the note A natural, the final movement ends on the note A flat. Maybe the composer was making a statement here to the effect of, if you're looking for a piece that begins and ends in the same key, you won't find it here. There is no doubt that Hindemith was a learned musician who absorbed Bach's practice of implied harmony into the template of his considerably modified harmonic idiom. Bartók wrote his Sonata for Solo Violin in North Carolina in 1944 at the behest of Yehudi Menuhin. It is his only contribution to the idiom. The Bartók sonata reflects very faithfully the Bach tradition. To begin with, the 4-movement pattern of tempos consciously recalls the same pattern to be heard in Bach's solo sonatas. The first movement of the Bartók is marked with the tempo of a chaconne and opens with a conscious pastiche of Bach's harmonic world. The second movement is a fugue, bearing some of the characteristics of the fugues in Bach's solo sonatas. There is no doubt that the Bartók sonata is the best known of solo violin works from the last century, in part due to Menuhin's tireless championing and recording of the piece. Not all musicians, however, seem to be in agreement regarding how innate the writing is from a violinistic point of view. On the one hand, the piece is playable. On the other hand, the conductor Anatol Durati, who knew both Bartók and Menuhin personally, has called it a fiendishly difficult work. Menuhin himself was convinced that the piece was almost unplayable after looking over the manuscript for the first time. It is worth recalling that every composer referred to so far, except Bartók, was a violinist. While Bach is remembered primarily as an organist, he was also a highly skilled practitioner of the viola in addition to the violin. Looking at the solo violin world today, my impression is one of great diversity, with each composer doing his or her own thing, which in many respects is refreshing. An example of a very captivating piece written by a living composer is the Cadenza for solo violin by the Polish composer Penderecki, and the piece was written in 1984. You'll find more than one live performance of the piece on YouTube. So we now come to my Partita for solo violin. More by coincidence than by design, the piece is written in the same key as the Bach sonata, G minor. This is a wonderful key for the violin, for it draws on open strings. An open string is the name of the string which sounds when it is not stopped to produce a particular note. So the new piece could be regarded as a prism which refracts different aspects of East European music with a leaning towards the Jewish. It comprises 4 movements. Unlike Bach's solo partitas, the work I have written does not comprise a succession of dance movements. Instead, I have chosen the term partita as a generic title for a multi-movement composition spanning a wide spectrum of emotions and moods. So we will now hear Anna play my piece, which will be the first performance, and after the piece has been played, there will be plenty of scope for questions.
Well, many, many papers about it, all of that. And here's a piece you have. You're actually the foundation player of that. Others can be influenced by you. You had no image in your mind other than what you saw through the notes on the paper. How is it playing something for the first time?
It's quite liberating in a way, not having a recording to sort of compare yourself to. Like with the Bach, it's hard to have your own approach about it when you've heard so many great recordings from legendary violinists. So it's nice to have a piece that's clean slate, and I can go more by instinct and follow that. Yeah, and actually, it really pushes me to think more about the piece.
How did you react to what Anna was doing?
I could not be happy with the final.
I'm sure of that. I heard it myself.
Yeah.
But as it went along,
my philosophy is to encourage people interpreting my work to bring to those pieces ideas that they wrote. Yeah.
I know that's a major theme of yours, that cooperation or that joint partnership in the creative process, which I think no wonder Anna feels liberated. It's a wonderful attitude to have. Do you play the violin?
No.
Not at all?
No. Yeah.
So how did you hear the music before you heard Anna play it?
Well, I've been writing for the violin for a while now,
so you could hear it in your head.
Yeah.
Like Beethoven after his deafness came.
Yeah, I think with one difference, he's associated very much with the piano, but he was a violinist. He was a violinist.
Robin.
Perhaps following on from Judith's comment and question, it sounded very violinistic to me, which is a testament, I think, to both the competence of, high level of skill, I should say, not the competence, enormous skill of both of you. But I wondered, and I particularly loved what I found the very conversational character of the third movement, I think it was. I just thought it was so. But I wondered if you might comment on a little bit more on the partnership of writing for the violin and that you might have had in the process of composition.
Can you be more specific in terms of how the piece came to be written? Or
well, I wondered whether you were actually collaborating with Anna during the process.
No. The piece was finished.
Yeah.
And she didn't give you any little hints, tips, suggestions?
Not.
And you weren't listening if she did. That's good.
If there had been something categorically unplayable, I think she would have no.
Yes.
A question for Anna. I'm sorry. Question for Anna. What's next for Anna? In other words, where are you up to in terms of your career and career development?
Well, I'm actually studying in Germany at the moment, in Cologne. I just did 4 months of a master's, so 3 quarters to go. I'm really enjoying studying with my teacher there, and being immersed in the rich culture there as well, like so many great concerts. And I mean, Beethoven was born 45 minutes out of town. It's completely different, yeah. What's next? I'm here until March, and then I go back. Yeah, I'm just spending time with family, seeing my old teacher, yeah.
That's why you couldn't get an encore performance. She's leaving us to go back to study. How about you? What are you working on?
Working on a piece for violin.
It's not a secret. Tell them.
Piece for violin and cello.
Oh, and cello.
Yeah, it's commission work will be played towards the end of this year.
And how does that compare in mood or content or emotion to this piece?
The new work for violin and cello is a very close to response to the bushfires. Yeah. So the title of the piece is "If Sorrow Is a Fire." So I'm really looking forward to hearing it.
Well, you made me cry with this one. I think I'm not going to listen to that one. It's too dangerous.
Right. Yeah, but I will let you know when it's being played.
By all means, please. I think we'd all like to know.
Well, the Royal Society should think about sponsoring that and bringing it here.
That would be quite amazing.
Just a suggestion. suggestion from
When are you back, Anna? And what cellists do you know?
Oh, no, yeah.
I'll bet you do.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Anyway, great success.
Yeah, the Bach was difficult. It was actually the first time I played a whole sonata, all in one go. I'd done movements before, competitions and concerts and stuff. But
The Bach.
Yeah, the Bach I found particularly challenging to play the whole way through without.
Well, no one here realised that.
Yeah.
You didn't seem to need very much help. You,
It was a good experience. Challenging acoustic. But it was good.
Any further questions or explorations? I think
just
our
a quick
time is
question.
just about up. Go ahead.
Sorry to
No,
cut in again,
please.
but from what was said, this is a unique, in other words, unprecedented event here, isn't it?
It is event for the SMSA and for the Royal Society.
So the logical next step is when are you going to join together to do something like this again? Because
Well,
this was fantastic.
We've been doing a series called Speaking of Music, which is kind of occasional. I'll tell you what, probably shouldn't say this, but maybe it'll put pressure on the gentleman in question. The next one that we've got lined up, but we can't get him to give us a date, is John Valance, the state librarian, on classical piano. He's a pianist. He's an outstanding pianist, and it would be something similar to this, but he'd do the talking and the playing. So maybe that will be next. We have some others online too coming up, but it's very good to hear you saying you'd like to have more, because this was an experiment for us, and it has worked out very well so far. The first one was jazz.
Premieres.
We can try. Okay, I think it is about time for us to thank you, and those of us who are going to dinner move on. We have a special treat for you for the vote of thanks, which is someone known both to the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts and the Royal Society. This is she of Jane Austen and the Enlightenment and literary tours just about anywhere in the world. One of our favorite speakers, Susanna Fullerton, is in the audience, and she has kindly agreed to accept the privilege of giving the vote of thanks. So, Susanna.
A few years ago, I gave a talk here at the Royal Society on the great diarist Samuel Pepys, and I couldn't help but think of Pepys this evening. He was a president of the Royal Society. He absolutely adored music. He wrote once in his diary, "Music and women I cannot but give way to, whatever my business is." And I think Pepys would have been so happy tonight. Here we are in a room full of books, which of course he loved. We were listening to music. We were learning so much about music, about a composer who actually lived at the same time as Pepys, born a little after Pepys, but they were actually contemporaries, and with a very intelligent and select audience appreciating all that we were learning. So I think Pepys would have had an absolutely marvellous evening. I think also he would have gone away and recorded in his diary his huge excitement at hearing a world premiere. Pepys always loved to be in at the first of something, and he would have gone home and written something about mighty fine piece of music, best I ever heard in my life. He was very fond of superlatives in his diary. So I think this evening we can all feel, as Samuel Pepys would have done, attending such a very, very special evening. We have learned so much from David about why Bach was a giant, and about the other giants who then stood on his shoulders and created music in response to what they had learned from Bach. It was fascinating to hear about pieces for single instruments, fugues for single instruments, and the effect on the Romantic era, and that the unaccompanied violin suddenly became popular again in the Romantic era. And from Paganini through to Bartók, leading, of course, to David's beautiful, beautiful piece this evening. We have just learned so much about music and how one composer can have such an influence on so many who follow. And we have been incredibly privileged tonight to hear a magnificent world premiere. We've been so fortunate to have such a wonderful musician. I can predict a great future for Anna. I think she's an incredibly talented young musician, and she's going to go on and do marvellous things in her musical career, and I'm sure you'll join me in wishing her all the best for her wonderful musical future. Pepys might have been a little astonished to see a woman playing the violin, because they didn't always have that sort of opportunity in his era, but of course we have progress, and it's absolutely marvellous to see a talented young woman making such a wonderful career in music. And David, for all you have given us tonight, for your fascinating talk, for that incredibly special world premiere, would you all please join me in saying a huge thank you to Anna and to David. Thank you so much.